Hey everyone, it's Aaron White, and I'll show you how to deploy a full stack JavaScript app to AWS in this tutorial. So to follow along, there are a couple prerequisites you'll need. One is an AWS account. You'll also need an available domain name in Route 53. On your local computer, you'll need the AWS CLI installed. You'll need Node and Terraform. You don't really need to know Terraform because the code's already written, but you'll need to be able to execute the Terraform scripts. Without any further ado, let's just look at what we'll deploy here. This is a multi-region deployment. So we're going to deploy a SPA app, a React app, to an S3 bucket. That S3 bucket will live in US West 2. You can change that in the code, but for me, it will live in US West 2. And then the CloudFront distributions will live in US East 1. And the correlating SSL certificates will live in US East 1 also. So what will happen is when we run these scripts, we'll create three S3 buckets. One for the infrastructure, one for the Apex domain. In my case, it'll be sdaij.com. And then that domain will redirect to the canonical URL, which will be www.sdaij.com. Your domain name will obviously be different. So I'm using React, Vite, and Tailwind for this application. Again, you could change that out, but for this boilerplate code, that's what I like to use. It's a really great framework to get started with. The API will live at api.yourdomain.com. In my case, it'll be sdaij.com. We'll create an API gateway endpoint that points to an Lambda function with least privilege. So to get started, you need to clone the repository, and then we have to give these bash scripts the appropriate permission to run execution commands. So I'll just paste this into my editor, and then I'll change in the infrastructure folder. So let's look at my domain name. I have a couple routes here. They're really just for the name servers. And so it's really important to understand that you should be using a domain name that isn't doing anything yet, or maybe that you're okay if something goes wrong. So I have checks in the scripts to make sure that it gets installed correctly, that we're pulling in the correct hosted zone ID, and that everything should work. But if you get any errors, what can happen is AWS can create another zone for your domain name, and basically nothing will work. So just be aware of that. That's why I have these checks in the bash file to say, okay, let's get the hosted zone, let's make sure it exists, because I don't want you creating another hosted zone and then it breeds confusion and whatnot. So how do we run this script? Well, there are a couple different ways. You can call the setup file and pass your domain name, or you can just call the setup file and it will ask you for your domain name. So I'll type in sdaij.com. If the domain doesn't exist in my account, it won't let me continue. The other thing that will happen is we have to create a couple S3 buckets here. One will be infra.sdaij.com, one for the S3 bucket for the Apex domain, and then the www version. If any of those bucket names aren't available, the script will crash on you also. So those buckets have to be globally unique. It doesn't matter, if you're deploying this in a different region. If somebody else has those buckets, or if you have those buckets, the script will continue if you have the bucket. So you want to make sure that they're empty and they're not important, because it could override things. All right, so I'll enter the domain name. It's going to go out and check that in Route 53, and it's going to create my React app also. So the API is pretty boilerplate. It's just a few lines of code, but we'll use the package file to do the install, and likewise the web folder gets created, and everything for your SPA app is in there. So you're seeing the node modules get installed, the TS config, like all this stuff just works right out of the box. The goal of this repository was to give me boilerplate code so I could spin up a new application pretty quickly with an API endpoint. That could be like a contact us form or something else. It could be a database, but it's really not intended to be a multi-environment deployment where you have like testing and staging and prod. It's really just built for just a single application with a few endpoints, and you could add those. Okay, so it looks like everything's been created. So let's see if we have an S3 bucket here. And it looks like we have that. So we should also have a state file in here. So state is now remote, meaning you could pull this in and run it off of multiple computers. It's not just tied to this one computer. We should also have a config. So let's look at that and make sure our hosted zone matches up with what is in Route 53, and it absolutely should. So there we go. So that's kind of our check. Now, if for some reason that doesn't work, you'll get a message the domain wasn't imported, and then you should get a message to import that. That has to be in the Terraform state code. Otherwise, again, it will create another Route 53 record. Okay, so the next steps is really just to deploy everything. So what will happen is we'll create a couple DNS records in Route 53 to verify the ACMs, and also we'll create one for the API subdomain for API gateway and the www version and the Apex record. So let's just go ahead and deploy. So the majority of the time to make this deployment will be based on these CloudFront distributions. If we go in, the certificates, they won't take very long. They're probably already doing validation here. They're probably already creating the S3 buckets. If I go back, those are probably already created for the Apex domain and the subdomain for the canonical URL. CloudFront probably isn't started yet. Let's just filter it down to make sure. API gateway domain probably isn't created. It's going to take a little bit for all that stuff. Let's go to APIs here. Yeah, so not quite yet. These have been created. It's saying they're not in use, so that means that we should also see the CNAME validation. So this is for the SSL certificates. I'm doing the DNS validation. If this kind of just hangs here and it doesn't really do anything, it's a high probability that it can't verify your domain name. Even though it's in AWS, every once in a while you might experience that. And you basically just have to destroy everything and recreate. So these are going to take a while to create. The certificates, it looks like those have already been created. See if it's been created for the subdomain. So again, I'm in Oregon here for those certificates. And this one's North Virginia for the Apex domain and the canonical domain. We should see some CloudWatch groups being created for your API gateway and Lambda function. And our Lambda function should also be created. Looks like that's all good too. And you'll notice I'm using node 18. You can increment that if you need to, but that allows you to use the most recent version as of this recording for the AWS SDK. And these CloudFront distributions will take maybe it might be 10 minutes, it might be 15 minutes. So in a second, I'm going to pause the video so I'm not chewing up a bunch of time. So we have the role here created, the I'm role, and the policy, the attached policy should be created also. And this is, again, it doesn't have anything unnecessary. It's just put log stream and put log events. So that looks good. So our overviewing architecture is actually already being implemented. We have our S3 buckets. Won't have the web app yet, but here within a few minutes that will get deployed. The other thing we'll see, if we go into this version, no invalidations, but you'll see an invalidation here as soon as that's created, because we'll deploy the web app that gets called next. And when that web app deploys, it looks for that index.html file, and if it doesn't see it, or even if it does see it, I should say, it will try and invalidate it. So you always have a fresh version of your web app. Okay, so we're just going to pause here for a second, and I'll resume once this is all created. All right, so the deployment has finished, but I do have an error. It's with the API gateway domain. So what I'll do is refresh this. You can see that these deployments have executed. When we go over to API gateway, you'll see that there is probably this new domain here, this new API right there, but the domain isn't associated with it. So this is what I was warning about earlier. So everything actually worked except for that. So what I can do is just clear my screen and I'll rerun the deploy script. So again, all I have to do is rerun this deploy, and that will create the subdomain in Route 53. So if I come in here and refresh, you'll see the api.sdaij. It will get created here in a second. You can see it's already creating it in the API gateway location for custom domains. And we just have to wait for it to create and validate here. Looks like it's there. And our whole application should now function. So what I can do is just copy the domain name and visit it, and I should get a web app here. And it's saying it's unable to retrieve the information from the API, but that's fine. I kind of actually expected it. So what happens is this might take a few minutes just to propagate, but you can see the app, and we'll go through this here in a second. It's really just an SSL certificate most likely, but you can see it's not the highlight of this deployment, but you can see that everything does actually work. It works in mobile and all that kind of stuff, so that's pretty good. So everything should be good. So if I refresh this, it may or may not work. Okay, clean code. And if I go to API, you can kind of see just a couple of the names of books in this case that are being displayed here. So if I visit the site without the canonical version, the www, it will redirect me. If I don't have the HTTPS, again, you get redirected on all these requests. You'll be redirected to the canonical URL. So that's really great too. So lastly, what I want to do is make a quick update and see if I can redeploy just the web app and not the API side. So to do that, what I can do is just call the web. Actually, I need to change something. So let's go into the source and home, and we'll go down to welcome to SDAIJ. We'll save that, and now we'll just redeploy the web app. So if I go in and I look at the CloudFront distribution for this, under invalidations, it will create an invalidation for this once it deploys. So let's see if it starts that. So the reason this is important is because you deploy a new version of your web app, and you want to be able to manage that independently of your API. So you can deploy, if you want, you can deploy the API by using just the api.sh file. Similarly to what I did here, you just call API and it will deploy that, but you also need to be able to deploy your web, or if you want to deploy them both at the same time, you can just rerun the deploy script. That will create the invalidation. So now, if I refresh this, it probably won't work because it's cached in my browser. So I might have to go under here and say empty and refresh, and then it gets it. So your browser caching can play into this, but there we have it. We've deployed the Fullstack app to JavaScript, the Fullstack JavaScript app to AWS. We're hitting the API endpoint. You can do everything you really need to do for an app that just has like a contact form, or maybe you have a couple routes and you're connecting to a database and pulling information in. Obviously, for the web app itself, you'd have to kind of tweak the links and the colors and all that kind of stuff. You'd make it your own. But for just a pretty basic app with an API endpoint or two, this is pretty good boilerplate code just to get started and going. So I hope this helps you. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe. I'll put up some more videos and like this if it helped you. All right, thank you very much.